For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to Strat News Global, and welcome to this special web chat on Sri Lanka. As you're aware, India's Foreign Secretary Harsh Shringla is presently in Colombo to discuss various issues, obviously pertaining to bilateral relations. And as you're aware, there was a huge deal, a $700 million deal that was signed by Adani and the Sri Lankan Ports Authority on developing the West Container Terminal. That is seen as a huge plus in the bilateral relationship. And Harsh Shringla will also be there to look at what more India can offer Sri Lanka in terms of economic assistance and humanitarian aid. As you're aware, Sri Lanka has been in a bit of an economic crisis for some time. There's also inflation, food inflation, shortage of essential commodities. Clearly, India will be seeing to see what it can help to alleviate their issues. Let me get to our guest this evening. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, many of you would be familiar with him. He was India's Deputy High Commissioner in Sri Lanka. He was also Joint Secretary at MEA headquarters handling Sri Lanka, so he knows and understands the island and its politics very well. So welcome and thank you.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Sir, the Foreign Secretary's visit, clearly an effort to turn the back on a fairly contentious recent past, move forward and identify areas where we can, renew the relationship. Is it going to be that easy? What are the challenges ahead?
So, dealing with neighbors takes hard work, and building trust and confidence takes even harder work. So, I had written an article recently saying that the Indo-Lankan ties cannot be left to serendipity, and that we must work hard at it, both countries. I personally, I regret the fact that there has been a gap, because the last visit was from the External Affairs Minister in January, and we are now October, but better late than never. I see the Foreign Secretary's visit as an attempt to re-establish contact with the regime, particularly with the new Foreign Minister, Professor G.L. Peris, with Basil Rajapaksa, who is the Finance Minister, to take stock of the situation, because as you rightly said in your opening remarks, Sri Lanka is going through a crisis, and to see how India can cooperate with Sri Lanka better. As for the investment that you referred to, I would welcome any private sector investment in Sri Lanka. And the fact that we've got the Western terminal in Colombo is good news. But I would still say that we will have to talk to the Sri Lankans about the East Container Terminal, because it involved a governmental contract, and it was a tripartite contract between India, Japan, Sri Lanka. I personally think it is also a reflection for Sri Lanka's own credibility when it comes to international agreements and investment agreements. So we need to have a conversation with them and see where we can go with economics, trade, and investment. But as I said, this visit is more about re-establishing contact with some new ministers who've taken over. Yeah, I see that the Foreign Secretary has already met the Prime Minister at Temple Trees. He's expected to meet the President. So he will get a sense of where Sri Lanka is economically speaking, and where Sri Lanka wants to go with the relationship with India.
You mentioned the issues over the East Container Terminal, the fact that it was a tripartite agreement. How did this come apart? I mean, in your understanding, was there some issues with us? Was there something else?
My own sense is that politics intervened, and I don't think you can deny that. But there was also the issue of trade unions who protested the involvement of foreigners in general. I don't know whether it was directed to India or to Japan, but there was a general feeling that foreigners should not get involved in Eastern Terminal. So as I said, we need to have this conversation with Sri Lanka. And as long as Sri Lanka feels that they have to freeze the issue and then go forward with the rest of it, including the West Terminal. I now understand from reports that the deal the Indian company has got with the Western Terminal is way better than what we would have got with the Eastern Terminal in terms of controlling interest. They are likely to get 51%, the Indian company. So it does seem to be better. At the end of the day, Surya, I think India has to take a pragmatic view of its economic, trade, and investment involvement in Sri Lanka. What do you want to do with the terminal? Can the West Container Terminal do the trick? And for me, if it does the trick, we go ahead with that. The important thing is that Sri Lanka should, I think, look after its own credibility, because Japan is also involved. And Japan is a huge investor in South Asia. So I'm assuming and I'm hoping that Sri Lanka will give us a credible explanation of what went wrong with the East Container Terminal project. I think the Foreign Secretary will definitely get a sense from this from his interlocutors in Sri Lanka.
Now, China is generally perceived to be the elephant sitting in there in Colombo, influencing the Sri Lankan leadership, manipulating its way across. How do you see the Chinese role in Sri Lanka? Is it it is generally perceived to be inimical towards India?
I think there is no gainsaying the fact that China's role in Sri Lanka has grown. Compared to the time I was present in Colombo as Deputy High Commissioner, which was, we are talking about 20 years ago, and now there is no question at all. I think the question that needs to be asked is the present dire straits in which Sri Lanka finds itself economically and financially. How much of that can be attributed to the Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka? That's a question Sri Lankans have to ask. I'm not going to ask for them, but I think they have to ask the question. The second question, which follows from the first, is does that provide a window of opportunity for India? The third point I would make in response to your point is if you compare project to project, the kind of Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka and Indian involvement in Sri Lanka, there is no comparison in terms of the impact on people. Even after the present regime has come into power in Sri Lanka, we have given them quite a bit extensive help in terms of COVID, 500,000 doses. We gave them quite a bit of, liquid oxygen. Our Indian naval ship carried it. This is, I'm talking 2020, and not to mention 26 tons of medicines. So if you compare that with, let us say, investment by China in brick and mortar, which do you think is more important? We've got a hospital in Dikoya, Central Province. We've got an emergency ambulance service in Sri Lanka. We've got 50,000 homes which were built in the northeastern province. So frankly, while India can never match the deep purses of China, I think India should concentrate on its strengths, which are how can Indian investment trickle down to the average person in the street in Sri Lanka? On that count, I really see no comparison between Indian involvement in projects in Sri Lanka and Chinese involvement. Where I would ask or request India to improve is in the delivery, in terms of the time schedule, in terms of the time lag, in terms of bureaucracy. I think there we need to tighten our belts and pull up our socks. But in terms of the model for involvement in Sri Lanka, I would suggest India is pretty much on the right track. But at the end of the day, Sri Lanka is a sovereign nation. How much of Chinese involvement they want in Sri Lanka and how much of Indian involvement they want in Sri Lanka is something that Sri Lankans have to decide. And the people in power at a particular point will decide. I think for India, ultimately, there has to be a frank conversation in terms of security red lines that India may have in Sri Lanka. This must be conveyed to our friends in Sri Lanka. And I have no doubt from my own experience, if you convey this clearly to Sri Lanka will be happy to take into account your sensitivities. But if you are going to, I don't think we should be bothered too much about Chinese investment in a highway, or even in a port for that matter, because frankly, Sri Lanka is a sovereign nation, and economics, trade, investment, it is up to Sri Lanka to decide how much of Chinese investment they want there compared to the Indian investment. And maybe there is space for both. So that is the way I would see it.
So there is a criticism that the way India's approach towards these countries is, we tend to focus more on the soft part of it, investing in helping people, for instance, rather people-oriented focus of foreign policy. We've seen that in Afghanistan also, where we are criticized for, investing $3 billion, and today we are nowhere. Do you think we've made that same mistake in Sri Lanka?
I don't think so, Surya. My sense is, as I said, people centric projects is a good thing. It will keep us in good stead. I don't want to talk about Afghanistan, but since you mentioned it, even in Afghanistan, my sense is Indian involvement there will be remembered for a long time. The second thing that we need to do with neighboring countries is the policy should be divorced from personalities and individuals and should be focused on projects and people. Don't make your policy contingent on political personalities. My sense is we have been able to do that, and it's work in progress. So we don't want to make your foreign policy contingent on a particular president who may be in power for 5 years or 10 years. This has been India's effort all along. The evolution in India's neighborhood first policy has to be divorced from personalities and individuals, and it should focus exclusively on people. Can it benefit the people? Can it benefit Sri Lanka? Can it benefit the Sri Lankan polity? And I think the Sri Lankan people are a very mature lot. This is the oldest democracy we have. So I can bet my bottom dollar that if you invest properly and wisely, Sri Lankan people will appreciate it. So I think that should be really the neighborhood policy as I see it, with all neighbors, not just with Sri Lanka.
That may also engender a sense that it doesn't matter who's in power, India will still keep putting money in. It's a kind of
Absolutely.
a.
Absolutely.
Is that good?
I've just told you all the help that India has extended. It has been after the advent of the new president. The COVID assistance has been completely in the last 1 year. India as a first responder to any crisis. I mean, I still remember the Indian High Commissioner at that time was in India, and when tsunami struck Sri Lanka, the former President Chandrika Kumaratunga came on the phone line and talked to me. I was the Deputy High Commissioner, but I was the acting High Commissioner. And she said, Mohan, India needs Sri Lanka needs India's help. Within 24 hours, Surya, an Indian Air Force plane landed in Sri Lanka. The last two incidents that I can point out to you, again in the last 1 year, two ships in trouble. One was called Diamond, the other was called MV something. Both ships had caught fire. In both cases, India was the first responder. We reached the scene. We put and doused those fires in those two ships, which would have resulted in massive maritime pollution. I tend to think that the fact that India has got civilizational links with Sri Lanka, the fact that India was a first responder, whether it was tsunami, whether it is a ship which has caught fire, the first country that Sri Lanka turns to is India. So India's track record as a first responder and the fact that we can demonstrate we are a friend in need, these things will keep us in good stead. People will come and people will go on both sides. On both sides, we are democracies. Nobody is going to stay forever. I am taking a long-term view of the relationship. And the relationship post IPKF, I would say, has been one of civilizational ties. Secondly, of Sri Lanka depending on India as the first responder in any crisis. And third, yes, Sri Lanka has now more options on trade, investment, and technology. And I think we should respect that while making clear our red lines to this very close maritime neighbor.
So you mentioned red lines. Let's come to the Rajapaksa brothers. Is it your view they are anti-Indian? Are they just batting for Sri Lanka? How do you see it?
My my starting assumption with any neighborhood leader is they are all pro their country. So I would never begin with the assumption that the Rajapaksa brothers are anti-Indian. The Rajapaksa brothers are pro Sri Lanka. Start with that assumption. Then I assess them purely by actions, not by speeches. Because we are all democracies, we all tend to say things which can be, tailored to the domestic audience.
Yeah.
Indians do it, Sri Lankans do it. You remember the time when Tamil Nadu was involved in Sri Lankan politics. I'm
Yeah.
talking 20, 25 years ago, when
Yeah.
chief ministers in Tamil Nadu routinely happened to speak on Sri Lanka. So those things will happen, Surya. The point is, ultimately, I would assess a regime, and I think the Rajapaksa regime is no different, on the actions they have taken. So, and those actions must be divided into at least two categories. One, which impinges on the national security of India, which is a red line. The second, which is a choice that Sri Lanka has, and a legitimate choice that Sri Lanka has as a sovereign nation, and it can opt for Chinese investment over Indian investment. But even there, my sense is that at this point, there are enough voices in Sri Lanka which are telling the Sri Lankan government and others that, listen, the Chinese assistance is turning out to be very expensive. They are not transparent. The rate of interest is very high. And you all know what happened in Hambantota. The kind of, it's not utilized and so on, the white elephants, if you like. So I think the mood will shift. I see a window of opportunity, but I still think India should let Sri Lanka make that sovereign choice. Sri Lanka is a sovereign nation, they will make the choice. But as long as we are clear that our security interests are broadly taken care of, I would not have a problem. I think we should go with what is our strength, and I go back to our strengths, which are transparency, complete fiscal accountability, concern for environment, and more than anything else, people centric. If India can do this with all its projects and assistance, I don't see why we should worry, frankly, because people will make up their minds. They will decide what is better for them, isn't it?
So then, how do we deal with China? Do we just sit back, allow the Sri Lankans to sort the matter out on their own, convey our views on the Chinese presence there? What do we do?
So, as I said, I'm very clear. If there is a Chinese action in Sri Lanka that impinges on national security of India, I would certainly convey this very strongly to the Sri Lankans. There are appropriate channels for this, and this needs to be done privately, not through the public newspapers and not through, websites. You do that privately between two friendly neighbors. Everything else, India sticks to its strength. I mean, which do you think is better? I'm giving you a hospital in Decoya. I'm giving you an emergency ambulance service. I'm giving you 50,000 homes in northern eastern provinces for the internally displaced people. I'm giving you assistance, 500,000 doses. I'm giving you liquid oxygen. I'm putting out the fires in ships in your maritime zone. Tell me, does China do these things?
But
I ask you very frankly. They may be
but
giving
wait,
millions of dollars.
it doesn't seem to win us friends. Somehow they constantly slap us in the face, ignore our concern, invite the Chinese in. This keeps on happening. Look at
No, I,
Nepal, the same issue.
No, I think India has to be the bigger person in all these relationships, Surya. That's my honest view. We are a big country. We are a bigger country without a doubt. But when I say we've got to be the bigger person, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Ignore the pinpricks, ignore the ego things. These are countries which take their sovereignty maybe a little too seriously compared to India, because they need to protect their sovereignty vis-a-vis bigger countries. Once you accept that and you understand that, I think it becomes quite easy to deal with neighbors. I think the critical thing is to deliver the projects on the ground without delay. The moment you've gone and announced we are going to do something in neighboring countries, more than any other region of the world, in the neighborhood, you need to execute projects in a timely fashion. You can't afford to delay, because as it is, India has got a bit of a reputation in this
Yeah,
regard
yeah.
as a laggard. So you don't want that to happen. But on everything else, as I said, there are very, very important channels of communication open to you with Sri Lanka. After all, the foreign secretary has gone to Sri Lanka. He is meeting the prime minister. He's going to call on the president. He's going to meet the foreign minister. He's meeting his counterpart, foreign secretary. Tell me, with how many countries can you do this? So the fact is, you have channels of communication open to you. And I don't think we should go by political statements of leaders, the kind of internal political dynamics that happens. In fact, I am arguing that we should stay away from internal politics in these countries, stay away from internal political dynamics, stay away from personalities, focus only on country to country relation, projects, security, red lines, and I think things will be much better, frankly. Yes, India will face competition from China, without a doubt. And China has got deep purses, so you can't compete. So you compete where your competitive strengths are. And India's competitive strengths are, I repeat, civilizational ties, the kind of goodwill that we enjoy in Sri Lanka, the kind of projects that are people centric, and frankly, the kind of um, delivery that we can do, because we are a close neighbor. We can do it much better than other countries. And I think we should go ahead, play to our strengths, not compete with China in terms of money or in terms of purse, because you can't. You just can't
Yeah.
compete. That's just a
So,
fact of life.
sir, I have a last question. This is from a viewer, Bruce Wayne. I'm all for Sri Lankan sovereignty, but surely the Chinese are a threat. Can we have a European Union type security club join with Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka? What's your view?
That's an excellent question, Bruce. But the fact is, let me make two or three comments in reaction to that, because it's an excellent comment. First, South Asian integration is nowhere close to European integration. In fact, in the WTO, where I spent a fair bit of time in Geneva, the World Trade Organization, economically, we are the least integrated region globally now, especially with the Africa Free Trade Union having taken. Otherwise, I would have said Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But now I dare say that South Asia is lagging behind even Sub-Saharan Africa. So we're the least integrated region. On security, again, we have not been able to build regional architectures, because SARC, you know what has happened to SARC. Having said that, I must say there is something which is taking shape, which is very interesting, and that is why I like your point. And I think the Foreign Secretary will raise this as well. It is the Colombo Security Conclave that the National Security Advisor has been able to construct this over the last 2 years between India, Sri Lanka, and Maldives. And one of the things that this Colombo Security Conclave has got by way of applications is from Mauritius, Seychelles, and Bangladesh. They are observers so far, but they want to become members. If that happens, then I think your question or your point is well made. Maybe you are not looking at a European Union kind of situation, but you are looking at a nascent security architecture in the Indian Ocean. All these are Indian Ocean countries. So we are looking at India, Maldives, Sri Lanka, which already have a Colombo Security Enclave. You are looking at the possibility of admitting Bangladesh, Seychelles, and Maldives. I'm sorry, Bangladesh, Seychelles, and Mauritius.
Mauritius.
That would, to my mind, be an excellent security architecture in the Indian Ocean, which suits the needs of all the members. So that would be a response to your comment.
Great point, sir. We are completely at the end of our time. Pleasure talking to you, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, and I think we'll have to keep this discussion going in the months ahead as India-Sri Lanka ties evolve. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
And for all of you out there, Bruce Wayne and many others, thank you for tuning in, sending us your comments, observations, and questions. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel, track us on our website. Thank you and good night.